Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this Tuesday Scholar event. Our speaker today is Ari Hoptman, who will talk on the languages we speak and what happened to them. Ari Hoptman is a senior lecturer in German at the University of Minnesota, and he's been teaching there, he tells me, since his hair was black. He studies the interrelationships among languages, particularly English and German, and he's also interested in the teaching of grammar, particularly German grammar, which he says is not an easy thing. When he's not in the classroom, Professor Hoptman is an occasional playwright. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota, with financial support from the Ramsey County Library Friends organization. We are deeply grateful to both these groups. And now let me turn things over to our speaker, Ari Hoptman, on the languages we speak and what happened to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you. And glad you're all here. I'm just going to set this up. It'll take just a second. The languages we speak and what happened to them. And yeah, so I hope this will be fun. Well, there are thousands of languages out there spoken across the world. You may recognize this as the place where you live. This is the world, and many thousands of languages and many, many language families. What do I mean by language families? Families of languages are like regular families, are related in some way. So, for example, if you look at Portuguese and Spanish and French and Italian and Romanian, even if you don't speak any of these languages, you may have read that they are related to one another in some way, that if you speak Italian, that Spanish is not very far away, or if you speak Spanish, Portuguese is not very far away. French is a little farther away. So some languages might be related, but might not be as closely related to others. So that's the idea of a language family. So as I said, there are many language families out there, and we could talk about many of them, but we're going to restrict ourselves to just one family, a super family, as I call it, called Indo-European. Indo-European. Now, this language family has speakers that live in the shaded areas on this map. You can see this covers a lot of Europe, and there are some holes there. There's Iceland, Britain, Ireland, and then it extends into Iran and India. And this is why it was called Indo-European, because it extends from India, Indo, to Europe, European. And a moment's thought will demonstrate that that these languages, even if they are related, the languages of northern and central India and the languages of Europe and Russia, that knowing one of these languages doesn't mean that learning another one is very easy. A lot of time has elapsed since these were, well, maybe when these were recognizably when these were more recognizably family languages. We'll talk about where we think the origin of Indo-European was. We'll talk about that in a second, so I'll just go over this, pass by this slide. And we're going to talk about some subfamilies in Indo-European. One of them is Italic. Italic has, it's very close to the word Italy or Italia. And in Italic, we are familiar with the language called Latin. Even if we don't speak Latin or read Latin or write Latin, well, we know that it's out there. But Latin had some cousins that are not as well known, languages with names like Oscan and Umbrian and Venetic, and probably some other languages that we don't know about because there's no trace. Oscan, Umbrian, and Venetic are rare enough. That I think should make the point, but they all were eventually pushed aside by Latin. So that's why you've never heard of a university offering a course in beginning Oscan or an intermediate Venetic. There is the language family Hellenic, which gives us Greek, the language of Plato and of Aristotle and the New Testament, and still the national language of Greece. There is the Indo-Iranian language. So not just India, but India and Iran. That is this shaded area over here. And we're going to talk about that just a bit. So yeah, again, Indo-European, these languages, the languages spoken in the shaded areas are all related to each other in some way, mostly in terms of vocabulary. They have a similar vocabulary, although even saying that they have a similar vocabulary, if you looked at a language, if you looked at Farsi, the language, national language of Iran, and Icelandic, the national language of Iceland, you would really be wondering how you could say that they have a similar vocabulary. This is why you need about 100 years of research and comparison and so forth. But anyway, so the story of how these were determined to be related languages begins with a fellow named Sir William Jones, born 1764, died 1794. And Sir William Jones was the son of William Jones, not very creative in his family. But William Jones is known to us because he was the mathematician who had the idea of using this symbol to show the relationship between the radius of a circle and its circumference or its area. So young William Jones, young Sir William Jones had a lot to live up to, but he did okay. Jones was very interested in language, but times being what they were and similar to what they are now, he couldn't make a living just learning languages. So he had to enter the legal profession. He was posted to India, which was at that time a new colony of the British. So he was posted to Bengal, and he wanted to find out what languages were important to the people of India, and they told him, well, if you're going to learn anything, you should learn a language called Sanskrit. They didn't use the term Indo-Iranian at the time, but so Sanskrit was to India what Latin was to Europe. It was the old respected language that nobody spoke anymore, but was recognizable as an ancestor of the modern languages. So Jones learned Sanskrit and learned it very well. And since he already knew Latin and Greek very well, he started thinking, well, what if Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit were cousins, and that they descended from another language that no longer exists. So he was comparing the vocabulary, he was comparing the grammar, and he said, yeah, this can't be a coincidence. Well, he made a big speech about this, and not much happened for a couple of decades. But later on, there's my later on, scholars in Europe, especially in Germany, started to get very interested in Sanskrit and a language called Avestan, which was spoken in ancient Iran. And they actually got tremendously excited because they, for a while, were thinking that maybe Sanskrit was this parent language. Maybe all of these languages of Northern India and Europe had descended from Sanskrit. This actually is not the case. Actually, Jones had hit upon the right idea decades earlier. But the people but scholars of Germany, not just Germany, but primarily Germany, became very, very interested and in all of the specifics of Sanskrit it's a life. It's not a life I would choose sitting in my study, marking every exception to every grammatical rule in Sanskrit, but you do what you can. So the result was that eventually people found out that Sanskrit, Greek, Gothic, Latin, and Old Norse were related to each other. Again, because of similarities of certain vocabulary items and similarities in grammar, for example, grammatical endings, which in English, we don't really have many grammatical endings, but if you learn German or if you learn Latin, then you would see a lot of endings. And then if you learn Sanskrit, you would say, oh, after about your fourth or fifth year getting through all of those charts, you would say, oh, hey, there's some similarity. But Jones did it very quickly and did it over 200 years ago. So we don't have to do it today. So I'm not going to get into everything about Sanskrit, but again, you have languages like Russian, Lithuanian, Hindi, Polish, Czech, Swedish, Dutch, German, Yiddish, Roma, Slovenian, Spanish, Catalan, Portuguese, Afrikaans, etc., all part of this gigantic language group. So we're going to zero in on one, not Indo-Iranian, and not Italic, and not Hellenic, but Germanic, just for a bit. Now, English is a Germanic language, and if you're listening to me now and you understand what I'm talking about, congratulations, you are very familiar with a Germanic language. The Germanic language branch made its entrance into the world known through a consonant shift. So all of the language families changed in certain ways, but Germanic did it in a very dramatic way. It took the consonants p, t, and k. It took some other ones too, but these are ones we'll talk about, and it shifted them. So what the old p and t and k became in Germanic p and th and h. Why Germanic did this, nobody knows, but Germanic decided the old sounds were not working out for them. So where in Latin you have words like Pisces and tu brute, and unicorn, which is an animal that has one horn, in Germanic you had words like fishes and thou and horn, p, t, and k, f, th, and h. Or you had words like pedal, from the word ped meaning foot, or tres, 1, 2, 3, or cardio in Greek. And in Germanic, you had words like foot and three and hart, which just became heart after a while. So this is the Germanic consonant shift. What's important to remember is that we're not talking about foot, three, and heart coming from pedal, tres, and cardio. We're talking about a separate development. So Latin goes on its own and develops words like ped. I added pedal so that you can have a recognizable word. I could have also added pedestrian, a walker. And in Germanic, eventually you have the word foot. That little explosion is the consonant shift, which happened at some point for reasons unknown to each other. So again, Germanic from Latin, no. Germanic alongside Latin, yes. Germanic makes its first appearance in writing in the 4th century with the Gothic Bible. The Gothic Bible. Now here, the Goths the Goths got around in history, but at one point they were in modern Romania, and a fellow by the name of Bishop Wulfila was largely responsible for Christianizing the Goths. They had before practiced a Germanic religion, and because he was fluent in both Greek and Gothic, he was able to produce this, the Codex Argentius, the Gothic Bible, which is a translation of large chunks of the New Testament, not the whole thing, but enough to keep anyone busy for a good lifetime. And if you read, you notice the alphabet is a little different, but not, you can recognize some letters like, there's a K, the second letter is a K, and there's an I, and there's an A, and there's T's, and some other letters. So it wasn't a completely new alphabet, largely based on Greek. And the words that you find in the Gothic Bible are very often not all that strange. So for example, you find skippa and handus and fisk and dan and was and toi and sach and word and immer. Well, maybe those don't immediately come across as being familiar, but the English equivalents are ship and hand and fish and then and was and to and saw and word and him. Which is not to say that you can just open up a Gothic Bible and start reading. You do need to have some preparation. But the good news is we know exactly what Wulfila was writing about. He was doing a translation of the Bible from Greek, and he was not taking many liberties. So this is a wonderful document for linguists. Also interesting because we find a lot of everyday words that because it's a translation of the New Testament, we have the word, for example, thramsti, which is locust. So we know the Gothic word for locust. Why do we know the Gothic word for locust? Because John the Baptist lived in the desert and ate locusts or grasshoppers or crickets. But anyway, there's some word for insect that is thramsti, hard to say. If you look at this diagram, if you look at this page of the Bible, you can see some Greek psis. Here's one, psi or psi, however you choose to pronounce it. And Wulfila did a very clever thing. He needed th for the Gothic alphabet, And apparently Greek at the time didn't have a th, it does now. But what he did was he took this ps sound and he repurposed it to th. So when you see a word spelled like this is the word thu. This is thu. So not psu, but thu. So he repurposed it. He said this letter no longer th. I'm sorry, no longer ps, now th. So this was the first appearance of a Germanic, actually, there's a couple of runic inscriptions that are a bit older, but most of the runic inscriptions are actually younger than the Gothic Bible. So all those Norwegian, Swedish, Danish runes, almost all of them are younger. So let's talk about some fun technical stuff in Germanic and in other Indo-European languages. They might be more fun for me than for you, but I'll try my best yeah, I'll try my best. Anyway, so we're going to talk about something called upload, which is spelled with a B but pronounced with a P. Upload is a series of vowel alternations in Indo-European. They are ready-made vowel alternations, and you can take a vowel here and a vowel there and a vowel there, and you can come up with different related words. So for example, sing, sang, sung, choose, chose, chosen, see, saw, seen, give, gave, given. These are all examples of upload. Or if you speak German, die Sprache is language, der Spruch is a saying, das Sprichwort, also a saying, an old saying, a Sprichwort. Sprechen is to speak, and gesprochen is having spoken. So these are all examples of upload. You take different vowels and you come up with different words that are usually you can find the similarity of meaning. There are 6 categories of alternation, 6 categories of upload. Here's category 5. You get 4 vowels to choose from, I, A, E, and I. If you went to Gothic, there's the verb giban, gab, gebum, and gibans, to give, I gave, we gave, and having been given, giban, gab, gebum, gibans, which in English is give, gave, given. We took out, English decided to discard the 3rd vowel. So, but that's okay. That's languages change. But this is just one category of upload. As I said, there are 6. Now, it's not just about replacing vowels. Upload is not just about replacing vowels wholesale. Here's an example of Latin in Latin. Veni. Veni in Latin means come here. Veni. Hey, veni. So Julius Caesar said, Julius Caesar used the verb veni, veni, vidi, vici, or some people pronounce it veni, vidi, vici. It doesn't matter. I came, I saw, I conquered. However, where is it? Do I have it? Ah, yeah. However, vini, I'm sorry, I have to go back a bit. So vini with a short e means come here, but vini with a long a means I have come. Let's show it again. Veni und veni. So this is also an example of upload, stretching vowels to mean different things. So if you accidentally said veni, vidi, vici, and you were in Julius Caesar's time, you would not be saying I came, I saw, I conquered. You would be saying, hey, check this out. I saw and I conquered. So, but that's also pretty good. Hey, look what I did. I saw and I conquered. So upload can involve changing vowels, lengthening vowels, or something more mysterious. And I'm not going to tell you what it is for a little bit. Let's take the word feather, the English word feather, which has, if you take out the vowels for a minute, it has f, th, and Well, we just talked about f and th and and we talked about how they had changed. So if you take those out of the shift, you have p and t and p and t and like pedal and foot and like to and thou. Now, I know this might be going by very quickly, but you won't be quizzed on this later on. So if you get the general idea, that's okay. Actually, I'm going to reverse these because at the top, these are the older forms, p and t and and f and th and Okay, well, what do you do with that? Well, in Germanic, the sequence f, thur, which produced feather, means thing for flying. But in p, t, it just means a general idea of flying that can go in a lot of different directions. Okay, that's fine. Now, notice that I put p and t together. because sometimes upload is not just about changing vowels or stretching vowels. Sometimes it's about eliminating vowels, taking them out. So pter might be, you might think that's a little bit difficult to pronounce. Let's find out. Let's combine it with another root. This is a DNA strand. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Has that been there the whole time? A DNA, sorry, I just saw a message there that might have been there the whole time. A DNA strand, which, so I'm sorry, that's called a double helix, but we don't need a double helix. We just need one helix. So if you combine the aforementioned, if you combine that, you get the word, if you combine pter and helic, you have an helicopter, which is a device which flies by means of a screw or a one helic. So helicopter. There are other uses for it too. If you combine pter with the Greek word for finger, which is dactylos, then you can describe an animal which has wings attached to its long fingers, and that is a pterodactyl, or pterodactyl, because we don't like saying pt in English. So we just pretend the p is not there. Let's take another example of upload of, this is what's called the zero grade, when the vowel disappears completely. So here's a term which you don't really need to learn, called tmesis. Tmesis, no vowel in there, the act of cutting, So you're cutting a word into, for example, to pick up my brother from school, or to pick my brother up from school. You are cutting up the verb and putting it in two different spots. There are words that are related to tmesis that are a little more familiar. This one's not completely familiar. Tome, a volume of a book, a part of a larger work. So a tome 1, tome 2, and you can sometimes just say tome as a synonym of a book, especially if you're some 19th century writer. They were more familiar with they like the word tome a little better than we do now. If you like to study things that are cut up, then you're a medical student, you study anatomy, the science of what is cut up in the body. And if you like to study other things that have cuts, you can study animals with two cuts, some usually very, very small animals. And an animal with two cuts in Greek was called an entomos, And if you study such animals, you study entomology. It's the study of animals with two sections in their bodies. So, and this is not to be confused with etymology, which we're doing right now, the etymology of entomology. By the way, the Romans, they had these animals too, and they liked the way the Greeks thought of these creatures. And so whatever they called them previously, I don't know what the original Roman word for little bugs was, but they decided to follow the Greek example. And so they said, okay, we'll call this an animal which is put into two segments, and we call them animals with sections. And an animal with sections is called an insect. An animal with two cuts, the head, the thorax, and the abdomen, if you remember from high school. One more thing about this root: if you take a hunk of, say, manganese, and you cut the manganese in half, and you cut that 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 in half, and you keep doing that about 85 more times, you get to a level where you cannot cut the material apart anymore without it not being manganese anymore. So if you do one more cut, it will turn into free protons, neutrons, and electrons. So the cut above that, this point where it is inseparable, where this is the last time it can be recognized as manganese. This is an atom, a chunk of an element that cannot be cut apart, or it can be cut apart, but it's no longer the element. I fibbed before. There's one more that I'm going to talk about, but this is very brief. It has to do with memory. So admonish is when you remind someone of something bad that they did, or what they might do in the future. Reminisce is what you do that's more pleasant. It's a more pleasant way of remembering things. But if you have a condition that is away from any kind of memory, that is called amnesia. Amnesia, again, taking out the vowel. This is the 0 grade. This is probably the longest I've ever talked about the 0 grade of upload. So, and you were there. So, Allah, Huzzah. Again, called upload, which is a term invented by Jacob Grimm. Yes, Jacob Grimm of fairy tales, the fairy tales, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. This is him in an older age. He also invented a term called umlaut, which you might be more familiar with. Now, umlaut is these symbols here, and ü, the little dots above this. Sometimes they're called rock dots because they're used by heavy metal bands like Spinal Tap. But notice where Spinal Tap is putting the umlaut, they're putting it over the N, which doesn't make any sense. Umlauts have to go over vowels. So umlaut used to be, a long time ago, used to be a process, not just a couple of dots. It was a process. And so I have to give you a tiny bit of technical information, and but I think it'll make it clearer. So for reasons that I have never been able to understand, Indo-European likes to categorize words by putting vowels after the root. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a, e, I, o, u, and in here are words like in Latin agra, which means field, docere, which means to teach, gladius, which means sword, oculus, which means eyes, and manus, which means hand. So after the agr, you have an a, after the docere, you have an e, after the glad, you have an i, you have an after oculus, you have an o, and after manus, you have an u. Again, why this was necessary, I've never been able to figure out, but all Indo-European languages did it to some extent. Germanic too, although in English, these have died out completely. But if you go back a long time ago, you'll find words like dagas, which is the ancestor of day, gastis, well, I'm not going to tell you this, dagis, gastis, and ertho, which is the origin of the word earth. So what did the Germanic people do with these sounds? Well, if you had a word like gastis, the Germanic people seem to be obsessed with the I sound or the E sound, and they wanted to make word, if there was an E later in the word, they would anticipate it earlier in the word. So well, we'll give you some examples. So here is this is the E, or I in English, but E is the value that makes it a little clearer. I call it the evil eye because it affected so many words. So the aforementioned gastis came out to be, oh, sorry, one second, came out to be the word guest. So gastis became guest. So I have to go back, put it in the wrong order. So the idea is putting a little E in the A, combining the two vowels. So gastis became guest. By the way, I don't have a slide for it, but it's the same thing with man and many. So if you look at the word man, you will say it as man. If you see many, you will automatically assume that the Y, well, you'll anticipate the Y coming up, man, many. The Old High German word Furi, the Germans decided to put a little E in the U and came up with the word für. Here's guest again, mislabeled. The word Oldira in English, people decided to put a little E in the O and they came up with the word Oldira. Well, English doesn't have the sound so we chose the next best sound, which was E. So elder. Let me go back and show you. So oldera, and then very briefly, maybe for a few seconds, there was the word ulda, uldera, and then English decided, you know what, we don't do the sound. So we're just going to choose the closest sound to it. Again, elder. In German, 1,000 years ago or so, there was the word skoni. Skoni. Germans decided to put a little E in the O, put a little E in that O, and they came up with the word schön, schön. So we have words like schön und für and elder, and notice that the E, the vowel that was doing all the damage in the first place, it's gone, it's out of there. So what caused the umlaut? Now it's only clear to us because people scholars spent a lot of time reading German that was 1200 years old, reading English that was 1200 years old, and trying to figure out what happened, and eventually came up with this idea of I umlaut, or I umlaut, if you want to call it that. There's some other examples of this. Here is sit and sat in English, related by uplaut. And so you can take a suffix and add it to sat, and you get the verb satyan. Satyan. Satyan means, well, it's a verbal suffix that means to cause to do something. So satyan means to cause to sit. Guess what? A yot, a y sound is as good as an e sound. So instead of satyan, we have English set, sit and set. So set means to cause to sit, both through uplaut and umlaut. And when you do enough work in umlaut, as I wouldn't recommend it, but if you do spend a lot of time with umlaut, you find that, well, you can sometimes predict what words are going to be in, let's say, Gothic. Gothic was not really in love with umlaut. Gothic, there's not really any signs of umlaut in Gothic, which is another reason why it's so interesting, because it's very archaic. It doesn't do umlaut. It doesn't do a lot of other things. So if you have words like nati and batiza and fulian, you almost can guess what the words are, what the corresponding words are in English. Net and better and fill. Nati, net, batiza, better, fulian, and fill. Kind of neat. So that's what happened in, well, again, did not happen in Gothic, but it happened in other languages. So there was, so eventually, languages like German and English and Dutch dropped that evil I. The process wasn't possible anymore because the I was gone, but the vowels tended to hang around. And German especially decided to do things with these new sounds, and ü, for example, and just sort of say, well, what can we do with these sounds? Now that we got them, now that we can hear them, what are we going to do with them? For example, they took the word, this is the German word for word, about 1,000 years ago, Wort, and it was one Wort and two Wort, just like sheep and sheep in English, one sheep, two sheep. And that was good, and everyone knew and understood it from context. Well, it turns out that the Germans wanted to use these new sounds, these ers and us, and just sort of pepper them and salt them in the language where they could. So suddenly, instead of one Wort and two Wort, you have one Wort and two Wörter, two Wörter. So there were a lot of examples of this, of these new, so-called new sounds being used where they weren't being used before. Now, interestingly enough, of course, people knew what the word word meant, and they knew what, if no one got confused, because what we would say, these two words are beautiful. Okay, everybody understood it. So why the Germans needed to change two Wort to two Wörter, I don't know, but that's what they decided to do. So those are actually three gigantic categories we just covered. We covered a consonant shift, which created the Germanic languages. We talked about uplaut, which all Indo-European languages have to varying degrees. It's there. The idea in Indo-European was, here's a bunch of vowel alternations. If you want to use them, you can use them. If you don't want to use them, you don't have to use them. And we talked about umlaut, which at one time was a process, but now the process is no longer possible. So we just have the two dots to indicate a different kind of vowel. So much for the technical stuff. Now, the other part of the lecture, what happened? So the languages we speak and what happened to them. So we'll just take a few that we talked about. Greek, well, Greek was, as I said, it was the language of Plato, it was the language of Aristotle, it was the language of the New Testament, it was the language of the official language of the Roman Empire after the West fell, and it has continued to the present day. It's not the same, but it's not completely different from ancient Greek. So, huzzah. Sanskrit developed into, or I could say morphed into different languages. So just like Latin became Portuguese and Spanish and so forth, Sanskrit became Hindi and Punjabi and Bengali and Gujarati, which is the native language of Gandhi, and a bunch of other languages. There's a lot of languages in India, and a lot of them can be traced back to Sanskrit. Yet another reason why Sanskrit is so important to linguists and so important to people of India, some people in India anyway. What happened to Gothic? Well, the Goths got around. We saw them in their Romanian territory, but eventually they entered the Roman Empire and caused a lot of problems for the Romans, but the Romans had caused a lot of problems for the Goths. Everyone was causing a lot of problems for everyone else. Eventually, the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, fell in 476, and the Goths were able to set up some kingdoms in the former Roman Empire. There were the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. So some of them got to Spain, and some of them got to northern Africa. Sometimes the Germanic people went to war against each other, the Vandals versus the Goths, and so forth and so forth. But these kingdoms eventually fell too, which is why you don't have to learn on a modern map where the Gothic kingdoms are. So they just sort of faded into history. There's more that I could say about that, but I will actually, maybe if there's time later. What happened to German? Well, German did its own consonant shift. Again, remember, German was given birth to, in a way, by that big consonant shift with p to k. Guess what German decided to change? P to k. So it had inherited a p, t, and k and decided to change those. So whereas in English you had words like pepper, you have words like pepper and ten and water and make. In German you have words like Pfeffer and Zehn and Wasser and machen. So p, t, and k were changed to f and z and s and ch. Again, why this happened, nobody knows. You can, and again, you don't want to make the mistake of saying that German came from English or English came from German. They are cousins of each other. So here is the chart we had before. You can see Latin ped going off on its own. Germanic, we have the word foot, and the German English word foot, and the German word Fuß going off on its own. So actually, in a way, German is the more modern language, where English is actually the more old-fashioned language. German creates new consonants all over and has those ers and us, which English just didn't want to deal with. Latin, what happened with Latin? Well, as I sometimes like to say, people kept Latin alive by keeping it dead. What do I mean by that? Well, here I did my best Latin translation. Dico nunc per sumo cum hospitibus principaliter minnesotentibus de rebus linguisticis historicis. I am speaking now via Zoom with people primarily from Minnesota about things related to historical linguistics. So so this is based on, let's say, the language of Augustus Caesar, but for about, 1,500 years or more, people wrote Latin almost as if it were still the time of Augustus Caesar. They made changes, they added words, of course, they had their own stylistic changes, but as far as the grammar and the endings and so forth, when people were writing, they used much the same grammar as Augustus Caesar or Julius Caesar or Cicero, take your pick. However, what was happening in real Latin was becoming different languages, was morphing into Portuguese and Spanish and French and Italian and Romanian. Actually, it was morphing into localized versions of those languages, and the actual standard languages, those came later. And so, for example, there were, let's say, 50 different varieties of French, and someone eventually came by and said, hey, guess what? This is proper French. So whatever you guys are speaking now, we're going to call that a dialect, and this is now going to be called French. So I put that previous sentence into Google Translate. I do not speak Italian, but here this is what I got with Latin, and in Italian, it looks a lot different. Although there is the principalmente, principaliter. There's a few words that even I recognize, and I don't speak Italian. But we need to move on. So Italian is not the same as Latin, but it's a descendant of Latin. And we could actually have a conversation about is Latin dead? Is Italian really modern Latin? And there's actually an argument for that, but we'll move on. We'll see if people are interested. What happened to English? Well, here is a text in Old English. Old English is not Shakespeare and it's not Chaucer. It's even earlier than that. Old English is English from previous to the year 1100. I just grabbed a text at random. This is about Estonia, travels to Estonia. The guy is a report of travels. Dat Estland is Sweden Mitchell, and there bith Sweden Manipur, and an elkere burig bith König. En there bith Sweden Mitchell Honig, und Fischad, und der König, und der Ritschus men drinkat Mürenmelk, and der Unsperigen, and der Theoen drinkat Meadow. Now, this does not look or sound like modern English. Also, it's got these cool little letters. These are also for th. They didn't, the Old English speakers did not do what Wolfele did and repurpose the ps. They came up with some other symbols. So if you see anything that looks unusual, it's a th sound. If you, what it says is Estonia is very large, and there are there's many a large town, and in each town there's a king, and there is a lot of honey, and they fish, and the king and the most powerful people drink mare's milk, and the unfortunate and the servants drink mead. There are some words in this text that are still floating around. That is Mitchell is the same related to the word much and actually to the word name Mitchell, then personal name Mitchell. And there many, the word many, and on König is king, and there Honig is honey, and Fischer is the verb to fish, and König, again king. Richesten now means having a lot of money, but back then it meant more power, the most powerful. Men drinketh, they drink mare's milk, and unspedigen, the unfortunate, and drinketh, the verb drink medo. So there's actually a fair number of recognizable words in this if you choose your text properly. If you look at poetry, it's much, much harder. If you read Beowulf, then it's never going to be as easy as this is. And I had the word unspedigen, and you might think, well, unspedigen, that doesn't say anything to me. You said that was a survivor in modern English. Well, unspedigen means unfortunate, or people who are having bad, or not having success. But if you take the un off of it and you add the word good, you have Godspeed, which is great success, Godspeed, Godspeed. Etymologically has nothing to do with God. It's good success, and nothing to do with speed, as in. So what happened to English? Why is it so different? Why is it so different now than it was then? This is a complicated story. The short 30-second version is that here is England, and in the year 1066, there were two people from across the sea who were trying to take over the English crown. One was from Scandinavia, and one was from France. And actually, the French group had actually a couple of generations before been Vikings. So it gets very complicated. Anyway, well, it turned out that the French won. They took over England. They killed off the entire English aristocracy, and England became a French-speaking country for a couple of hundred years. So if you wanted to get anything done, you had to write either in French or in Latin. How much did the language change? If I say something like, it's been a sincere pleasure to enjoy your company here through the miracle of modern technology. I sincerely hope that the information was presented with some clarity and was at times entertaining. What if you wanted to take out all of the words that entered English from French or from Latin or from Greek? Well, you would be left with this. It's been to your ear through the I hope that was with some and was at times. It's like the microphone is cutting out over and over. So I'll show you the previous one. So pleasure, enjoy, company, miracle, modern technology, sincerely, information presented, clarity, entertaining. So a lot of these words are from French, Latin, or ancient Greek. Usually with an intermediary, the ancient Greek word comes in through Latin. The Romans say, oh, we like that Greek word. And so the Romans take it, it becomes a Latin word, it becomes a French word, it becomes an English word. We'll discuss it later. But there's been a lot, but it's actually almost impossible to get through through a couple of minutes without using a word that was taken from Latin, Greek, or Latin or French or ancient Greek. So for example, completely normal words like family, color, flower, animal, decide, music, vary, really, sound, street, and carry. These are all originally imports. These are all imports, and they're all completely normal words. We would be pretty lost if we didn't have these words today. And here, this is a little mind-blowing. Almost every single word in English that begins with P was originally a borrowing from another language. So people, person, part, pencil, plant, pork, purple, pill, pine, pest, pie, and pleasant. These are all words that originally came from French or Latin or ancient Greek. There's a few Germanic words, it seems, but really not many. So why did this happen? Because at some point, the Germanic tribes said, words beginning with P, thank you, no. If you looked at the Gothic Bible, which I mentioned a few minutes ago now, the Gothic Bible has about 25 words that begin with P. They are all taken from ancient Greek. They're all just borrowed wholesale from ancient Greek. So Wolf will look, oh, I need this word. Greek has this word. No, none of them are Germanic. If you read Beowulf, which is the greatest Old English epic of 3,000 lines, it's a 3,000 line poem. Guess how many words begin with P? 0, none of them. So why was this true? We don't know. So anyway, that's a bit about the languages we speak and what happened to at least some of them. And I offer my thanks to you. Thank you. Gratias tibi ago in Latin, danke in German, tak in Swedish, and then I don't want to risk mispronouncing it, but here is thank you in Greek, and I found a term for thank you in Sanskrit, which is a language I do not speak, but anugrikto sme. Well, if my Sanskrit is incorrect, you can let me know later. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much, Ari Hoptman. So now it's the turn of the audience. If you have questions for Ari Hoptman, please put them in the Q&A line and I will read them. We do have a couple of questions in there already, but I'm going to give myself a sort of first chance at this.
Okay.
Here is something that I have wondered forever. And I reveal how old I am when I say this, but you can tell anyway, I think. When I was in high school, everybody studied Latin, which already shows you how old I am, but there was the public school Latin and there was the Catholic school Latin. I went to Catholic school, and so we said Veni, Vidi, Vici. The public school students, my brothers went to public school and they said, no, 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 you're all wrong. It's weenie, weedy, weaky, which sounded hilarious to us students, particularly since we knew, this was before Vatican II. We knew that the Mass sounded like the way we were learning, Latin. So what's the difference? And where did the public school students come off thinking that they had the right pronunciation and we were wrong? And I've wondered that forever.
That is, yes, that's a complex topic. So as Latin went, as time went on, people were less and less interested in how, let's say, Augustus Caesar pronounced Latin. And so they said, well, we're going to pronounce Latin the way we do in Italy. So we're Italians, for example. So yes, we're going to create these soft G's, for example. So for example, the word agenda is agenda, even in Latin, or depending on your style of Latin. So what they did in the schools is some schools decided to Sorry, someone's trying to call me for some reason. They decided to aim for reconstructed Latin pronunciation. So trying to actually establish how Latin sounded in the time of Cicero. So I was exposed to both of that because I sang in a lot of choirs. So we sang a lot of, so Regina Caeli, Queen of Heaven, and then when I was taking my Latin course, we were not allowed to say that. We had to say Regina Caeli. Regina Caeli. We had a professor here, I say here, you don't know where I am, I'm at the University of Minnesota right now, just down the hall, and he would do a lot of reconstructed pronunciation, and he had us read aloud, and he was very, very nice, but he would not allow us to, we had to get our stresses in the right place, and we had to get our reconstructed pronunciation in the right place. So it's a question of tradition, which was the Church Latin, a tradition of mostly based on Italian, versus what people are trying to reconstruct for, let's say, 20 BC. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But how did they know what the Romans sounded like?
That is also, yes. There are some, I have a handout on that, by the way. I can send that to you. There are clues. And sometimes, for example, one clue would be, for example, how did the Greeks, if the Greeks heard a Latin word, how did they transcribe it? Did they transcribe, for example, Caesar with a k or with a s? That would be one way.
Okay.
There are other ways. There are other ways too, but that's not an irrelevant question. That's how do we know?
Okay.
And one more thing, my German colleagues are the German tradition of even reconstructed Latin is that a C at the beginning of word is a ts, so it is Caesar instead of, so it's not Kaiser and it's not Caesar, it's Caesar. And the Germans that I have met who talk about these things are ready to die on that hill. They are ready to die. They will not.
Well, thank you. You've really settled a lifelong question of mine. While we were talking about Veni Vidi Vici, there are many in the audience have put in questions. So let me turn to the audience now. First question, would Esperanto bring all of these back together? What is the case for Esperanto as a unifier?
Yes. So Esperanto, first of all, I'll give you a quick introduction to Esperanto. Esperanto was a language created in the early 20th century by an eye doctor named Ludwig Zamenhof, or Zamenhof, I'm not quite sure how he pronounced his name. And he was very well versed in a bunch of different languages. And he thought, you know what, if people could just have a language that they could use as a secondary language, he wasn't in favor of getting rid of any languages. He thought, let's just have an additional language based on a lot of different language families, and people would be much happier. So it has the flow of Italian, but it has a lot of Germanic roots. It has Slavic roots. We didn't even touch on Slavic today. I don't think it has anything from Sanskrit. So would it bring these things together? The problem is getting people to learn Esperanto and getting people to use Esperanto. So I went to an Esperanto meeting years ago, and there were 5 people there. Would it bring people together? Would it bring the languages back together? It would certainly help people like me teaching historical linguistics, but you'd have to learn it. Oh, and one footnote, it was thought to be lost, but someone discovered the only movie made in the Esperanto language, starring William Shatner.
That's wonderful. All right. You've used the words "they decided" frequently, says this questioner. Do we know how this happened? Who decided? How long did it take? How did it spread?
I've used it. I remember using it several times. I don't remember the specific context. For example, I think I said the Germans decided to put some E into the O. That is the biggest, question. Why did people decide to do things in the first place, and why did it spread? And so, for example, pepper, the English word pepper, became Pfeffer in German. Well, why? Someone had to be the first one to say Pfeffer instead of pepper. Pepper is the yeah, and that's the biggest question of all. Why did someone start to do it, and why did people imitate this? But this change must have happened from village to village. Oh, they say Pfeffer over there, and they're pretty smart, so we're going to say Pfeffer too.
Mhm.
Not a great answer, but it's what I got at the moment.
Yeah.
They decided.
You had mentioned that you didn't know that there was a relationship necessarily between Sanskrit and Eastern European languages, but we have a couple of questions on just these languages. Where did Eastern European languages like Polish come from?
There's a branch, the Slavic branch, which I didn't talk about, and then there's another, actually it's called the Balto-Slavic branch, and then that split off into a Slavic group, which included Russian and Polish and Czech and Bulgarian, and then of course there's always subfamilies there. You have to think of it, Southern Slavic and Northern Slavic, blah, blah, blah. Then the other branch of that was, if I remember my chart, the Baltic family, which includes Lithuanian and Latvian. So just another branch on the tree. I didn't have. That's interesting. I didn't include a family tree.
But I think the question has to do with they are part of the Indo-European family.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay. Absolutely. Yep.
All right. And we have another question very similar. Where do languages, Cyrillic alphabet languages fit in?
Oh, yeah. I know little bits and pieces about the Cyrillic alphabet. It's largely based on Greek, the Greek alphabet, and I think actually it was an expedition to Greece to, find an alphabet for their language, which was modified. There were a couple of, I know there were a few Eastern European alphabets, and Cyrillic became the most popular. I don't really know too much about it, except if you look at the Cyrillic alphabet and you look at the Greek alphabet, you see a lot of similarities, and it's not due to chance. The Greek, the Latin C, the Russian C, which is a S sound, is now I was going to talk about a variant of S in Greek, which is actually not that interesting. So anyway, I should have stopped one sentence earlier.
Right. Okay, now we have a question about something I've always wondered about too. Latin is an inflected language. It uses cases. So is German. So are the Slavic languages. English is not.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, English used to have as much inflection as German. If you look at English from the year 1000, it's got all of the endings that German has, and even a few more. What happened with English is that it went, I mentioned the invasion from France, and the English language went underground for quite a while, and it had to claw its way back up to the top. And by the time it had clawed its way back to the top, almost all of these endings were gone. So something happened during this underground period where English, they decided that they just didn't need these endings anymore. It could have been a way of sort of bridging the gap between English and French. So a simplified version of English, trying to meet in the middle to get to French. On the other hand, Dutch, which is sort of between English and German on the map, Dutch also gave up most of its endings. So the tendency in the Germanic languages is to get rid of endings, but that's not the tendency in language altogether. So you mentioned Russian is a highly inflected language. Old Icelandic, German, Finnish is so inflected. and people are happy, and they have no desire to give up anything. So if I would, I could actually talk for quite a while about English giving up its or Germanic going in a direction to give up endings. But I can say this. I can summarize. Germanic languages eventually decided that the root was the most important part. So the part of a word that carried meaning, that was important, and that endings were not so important. In a word, in Latin, you can say converse, which is based on the root verse, but you can also have conversation with the stress on a part of the word that doesn't mean anything. And Germanic decided, no, 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 no. We are not going to put stress on parts of the word that don't mean anything. English took this to its logical conclusion.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And now we have a question about sort of oddity languages. This person asks about Basque. Where did Basque come from? I think I've read that it's not Indo-European, yet
That
of
is
course
not.
it's spoken in parts of Spain and France. So what about, and to that category, I think I've heard that Finnish and Hungarian are also sort of orphan languages that way. Can you talk about, where do these sort of oddity languages arise?
Oddity, I like that. That's an interesting term.
Well,
Oddity.
I apologize to
No,
any
no, no, no,
Basque speakers
no.
in the audience.
Actually, I know a Basque speaker. So, so yeah, it is thought that Basque is the one of the few remaining non-Indo-European languages, a language that predates any Indo-European influence in Europe. So Basques love to, in general, I think, love to think that is the case, and it probably is the case. So it is not related to any other language in the world. Hungarian and Finnish and Estonian are relative newcomers compared to Basque. So the origin of Basque, nobody knows. But I think the Basque people like it that way. I think they love being this sort of island. And
does it relate somehow to the fact, Basque is spoken in very inaccessible mountainous areas between Spain and France? Is it geographic isolation that permits the continued existence of a language like Basque?
I don't really know too much about Basque, about where it's spoken, but the first thing that came to my mind is Swiss dialects, which are German, but sometimes in the mountains, they are so different and stay that way because they're in the mountains and the people don't have to interact with other people. And so they stay like that. But Basque is a complete mystery to me, but fortunately I have that one resource, so I can always go to him.
What happened to Goth? Did it morph into or influence any other language?
To Gothic?
Gothic, excuse me,
Oh,
Gothic,
sorry.
yes.
Yeah. Well, Gothic particularly, it didn't really, if it morphed into anything, it's not around anymore. The Goths they had relocated to the Mediterranean. There are sometimes some Germanic words in, for example, Sicilian might have a Germanic word, but it also might be from Old Norse because the Vikings got to Sicily too. But there's a postscript to Gothic, which is in the 17th century, a fellow by the name of Busbecq, who was an adventurer, because in those days you could be an adventurer and put that on your W-2s, what occupation, adventurer. And he ran into two people in Greece who apparently spoke Gothic as children, and they were from the Crimea. So he, not being a fool, he said, okay, I'm going to write down all these words. Tell me a bunch of words in Gothic. Unfortunately, he didn't write down a single sentence, so there's no context. But this was the last gasp of Gothic in the 17th century, I think, and it's called Gothic. So other than that, gone, alas.
The next question asks about the Gaelic languages, and what is their relationship?
Another
to the,
branch on, oh, sorry.
no, go
Another,
ahead.
another branch on the tree with Slavic and Italic and Hellenic and Indo-Iranian, and that's the Celtic family.
Mhm,
Um, what I can say is that the Celtic branch, the language, the Celtic languages used to be much more widespread. So if you were in Germany, or what is today Germany, or France, or even Italy, you would encounter Celtic
mhm,
languages there too.
mhm,
When Julius Caesar invaded Gallia, uh, he encountered Celtic speaking people. So it was around then. Um, and the word car is
mhm,
originally can be traced back to Gallic, to a Celtic language. So it's a borrowing from
hmm,
Latin, and the Romans took it from the Gallic language. Carry also, I think, car and carry
yeah.
are both from that.
So
Um, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
when Caesar writes about, all of Gaul being divided into three parts,
Mhm.
is that Gaul from the same as Gaelic? Are those two concepts related?
I think so. I think Gaul and Gaelic
Uh,
are the same. Yeah.
okay.
And then there's modern Scots Gaelic, and there's
Uh-huh.
Irish and Gaelic, and then there's so yeah, the Celtic languages not doing terribly well in Wales, doing pretty well. In
Mhm,
Scotland, I think it's down to 1% of the country speaks Gaelic.
mhm.
Irish, I don't know any figures there. And then there is a tiny Gaelic speaking population in northern France, but that's kind of an oddity because it's not a continuation of Gaelic. It is immigrants from Britain who came across
Oh,
and brought their language
uh-huh.
with them. So,
Okay.
yeah.
The next question relates to, you showed a passage of Old English and then you read it.
Mhm.
And there's two questions here. I have a question. My question is this, that when I saw it on the screen, um, it was incomprehensible to me,
Mhm.
but I uh, know some Dutch. I can speak a little bit of Dutch, and I used to know more, so I have a passive knowledge of Dutch. When you read it out loud, I could understand it to my
Mhm.
amazement.
Mhm.
And this questioner says that to her, when you read it out loud, it sounded like Gaelic. Well, I don't know Gaelic at all, but
Mhm.
what's going on there? You know,
In
I
my
was amazed that I could understand the Old English.
Yeah, there's I think there's just enough words in Old English that you have a chance if you speak
Mhm,
a language like Dutch or German. Again, this is prose. If you read Beowulf, I took a course in Beowulf, and
mhm.
I had been given a false sense of security about Old English, and then I got to Beowulf. I don't know anything that's going on here. As far as how it sounds Gaelic, that I don't know. Maybe it's the ch's that
Mhm.
are in there. Sometimes we're not sure whether Old English had the ch or the sh. As far as the pronunciation of Old English, that is uh, uh, again the pronunciation of Latin, the pronunciation of dead languages. This can be tricky. But one assumption that you can make is that you have people teaching the Anglo-Saxons an alphabet. So they say, okay, here's the Roman alphabet.
Mhm.
Here's what we use it for, and then the Old English people, the Anglo-Saxons, saying, okay, so when we write this word, this is how we're going to pronounce it, including double letters. So when they wrote double letters, they actually heard double letters because
Mhm.
yeah, so when you see double letters in Old English, you assume that that's what people
Mhm.
heard. And you also hope that there is not some gigantic random change
Mhm.
in the value of letters. And I have a handout on that.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Okay, now we have a question about written versus spoken language. And
Ooh.
this questioner wonders, are there some languages that were never written down, only verbal languages, and did they also evolve into modern languages? Do we have uh, spoken language progenitors for English?
Um, well, I would say most of what has ever been communicated has been through speech, and writing is
Mhm.
very much the exception. very much the
Mhm.
exception. It's really, well, especially in the last 25 years with social media and with chat and with emails, where we have communicated, where we have a written record of absolutely everything we think and we feel. But most languages throughout history um, have not had a written version. And even if they have had a written version, it's usually, so for example, I quoted Old English. How many people in Britain at that time could write? Very, 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 very few. How many Romans could write? Very, very, very few. How many Greeks could write? Very, very, very few. So really, it's having a written record is I think I used very about 7 times. I'm going to use one more time. Very much the exception. So the answer is pretty much all the languages you can think of that exist today have only existed as spoken languages throughout history. And you know, you don't, you know, people have, you know, people have survived and thrived without a written language. So it's never inevitable. Just sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't.
Your subject was how language changed to make the English we speak today. This questioner wants to know, how is English changing now? What are the changes going on at this time?
Oh, well, English has really embraced slang. I don't
Mhm.
know if it's really more than other languages, but it appears to be. We have a lot of slang that comes and goes, um, and a lot of informal language. Someone mentioned the difference between written language and spoken language. So we use a lot of language in speech that we wouldn't use in written language. I know I'm not just talking about swearing. Um,
Mhm.
um, and also, let's see, I notice sometimes there are small things that you notice. I've noticed, for example, politicians and even news readers, they're a little less formal than they were a couple of decades ago. I was watching a video of Queen Elizabeth from 1960, I think, and even her own personal way of speaking. It was so upper class in 1960. We are so happy to be able to greet you. And you listen to her 30 years later, and it's not informal, but it's not this extraordinarily upper class
Yeah.
version of English. And another change, this was going back along, I mentioned this example a lot because it's an excerpt from George Washington's inaugural address, where in one paragraph he says, I don't need a salary, I just need an expense account because I'm wealthy and you'll save some money. I don't understand anything he says in the paragraph because it's so complex and he's trying to use as many $5 Latin and Greek words as he can, and it's just incomprehensible. And I don't know how they understood it at the time.
Mhm. Okay, the next question, I think I'm just going to read this. Often I uh, sometimes change questions a little bit just for the sake of time, but this question starts out really as a compliment, and then it digresses. So
Okay.
I'll just read this verbatim. Holy moly, your brain must be about to explode. That's all fascinating stuff, and it appears you've drilled down pretty deeply. Fascinating, but, and then comes the but,
Uh-oh.
what are the practical, applicable aspects of this exegesis?
Well, that's always the trick, isn't it? As Han Solo said. Um, yes. Well, the practical here's a practical application of, for example, knowing something about Latin. If you learn Latin in school, then such a high percentage of English words are from Latin or French, and so many French words are actually from Latin. So when you learn Latin, you're really learning a lot about English at the same time. Um, and when you learn Latin and German, these are heavily inflected languages, and you can't take 2 steps without getting the ending right. Oh my gosh, I have to do this. And it helps train you for not speaking English as a native speaker, but maybe writing English writing formal papers. So in German or in German and Latin, for example, you have to know, okay, is this the subject or the direct object? And if you don't know which is which, you get a half point off or a full point off. Whereas in English, these things are not marked, but sometimes you get yourself backed into a corner in English. You say, wait a minute, this sentence is wrong. Why is it? Oh, this is a subject, this is direct object, and this is, okay, that helps me a little bit. So that's Latin. Greek might help you the same way. I tried to learn some Greek and didn't get very far. And as far as Sanskrit, yeah, that's you gotta really want to learn Sanskrit. There was someone in this building who would approach me he was the Sanskrit professor, and he would say, "So Ari, are you gonna do this year?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if I have time." But learning about uplaut and umlaut, yeah, I think you really have to want to learn it. I don't know if knowing about uplaut and umlaut consciously could help you, but I appreciate the compliment very much. That's
Okay. All right, a very interesting question. If human roots are from Africa, is there a link between African languages and Indo-European ones?
The answer is probably, as the Germans like to say, jein, which is ja and nein together. And this is the big question: what preceded Indo-European? Now, there was a scholar by the name of Holger Petersen who came up with this idea of Nostratic. Nostratic is the world language from Latin noster, which means our. So the idea was it was our language. And he said he tried to find a way to unite all of the language families of the world, and show, okay, if you have languages in Indonesia, this is how they changed and how they can relate to Indo-European and so forth. My own personal view is, I think this is, even if it's right, you have to, I mean, Indo-European is hard enough, and then to relate it to all the languages of the world, whether in Africa or Indonesia or Greenland, I think this is a very tall order. What came before Indo-European, I cannot say. The only thing I can say is that there may have been one origin of language, for example, in Africa, or there may have been different people across the country, across the globe, may have stumbled upon language. So there may have been language may have developed in different parts of the world at different times after people had, let's say, had spread out from Africa. But it was so long ago. Nostratic might be right, but that's, as they say, above my pay grade.
Okay. All right. The next questioner has an observation about English and, no, excuse me, about Italian and French. Italians like to adopt English words, not just for technology, but even for basic things. The French, on the other hand, resist adopting English, and they have an academy to preserve the purity of the language. What about the Germans? And I'm going to add there, what does that say, if anything, about the respective cultures of the ones who embrace English words and the ones who reject them?
That last part's the toughest part, of course. Yes, French resists these words. There's a policy, I think an official policy, that says you cannot, you're not supposed to use a foreign word if there is a French word that is in existence. Icelandic also does the same thing. I once looked at the Icelandic version of Microsoft Word, and all of the what's it called on the top? Well, all of the options are words that are this long because they're translations of the English terms. The drop-down menus. That's what I was going to say. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. German usually likes people to use the more Germanic word, but it doesn't always work. So, for example, the word for computer, they wanted people to use the word Rechner, which is the same word as reckon, a reckoner, but it didn't work. Der Computer. They wanted the word Fernsprecher still exists, Fernsprecher, but the word is telephone, and everyone says telephone. Well, now everyone says handy, which is a different story. And what does it say? Well, I don't know. German has always been pretty open to new words, especially from French. German and French have had a very uneasy relationship. The Germans have always said, oh yes, these words, these French words are really fascinating. And actually in the 18th century, there were actually movements to rediscover the German language, because if you read German from that period, it's this French, 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 and you think, oh, don't you know any German words? Aren't you actually German? So I'm going in 5 different directions at the same time. But I don't. I've thought about this, but I haven't come to any. I don't have an opinion. I don't have an opinion about what this means about the culture, which doesn't mean one shouldn't form and one, these are things to think about. But I kind of like that Icelandic is, because I do Germanic. I like the fact that Icelandic is trying to keep Icelandic alive. They had a rough time with finding an Icelandic word for cell phone, but they did it.
At this point, I should point out we have just about 10 minutes left, and we have about 20 questions, far more than we had when we started even. So we're going to just power through and try to answer as many as possible. The questions are wonderful, and I want to apologize to those whose questions I don't get to. It's not because they're not excellent questions. How do you trace the etymology of the etymology of a particular word? For example, English words that start with P.
Well, you look at fortunately, English has a 1,200-year track record, longer than many languages, not as long as some other languages. But so you look, you read everything you can. And this is what they did in the 19th century. They read everything and they listed everything they could find. And so you just keep going back and you say, okay, did the word exist back then? Did it exist in the same form? And do we think it meant the same thing? And sometimes the meaning changes quite a bit.
Okay. Why does Farsi, Persian, which is an Indo-European language, use the Arabic alphabet with some variations?
Couldn't tell you. Farsi is an Indo-European language, and I do not know the history well enough to know why it uses that alphabet. However, I can say "Baradaram dar Iran zindagi mikone," which is the only sentence I can say in Farsi. My brother lives in Iran, which he doesn't, but that's what I can say.
Okay, very good. Here's a comment. I think I've learned somewhere that Russians use the Cyrillic alphabet because Saint Cyril used that alphabet in his translation of the Bible for the Eastern Orthodox Church. Do you know anything about that?
Don't know it. Wouldn't surprise me. My knowledge of Slavic is very sketchy, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised. Bible translations usually tend to be extremely influential. I mentioned the Gothic Bible, well, influential among the Goths. The Latin Bible, St. Jerome translated the Bible from Greek into Latin, retranslated. There was one before that. The King James Bible. So Bible translations tend to, or Martin Luther, I could have mentioned Martin Luther. Bible translation. As a matter of fact, well, no, I was going to tell a long, irrelevant story about it. Sorry.
Well, we'll try to get as many questions in as we can. So here's a question about Norwegian. What are the origins of the Norwegian language?
This is a question that you sometimes have to reformulate as, what is the origin of the Norwegian languages? Because there are actually 2 official languages in Norway.
Okay.
One is almost identical to Danish, because the Danes controlled Norway for a long time. So if you can read Norwegian, you can read Danish. However, in the 19th century, I forgot his name, Ifar something, he has a name, decided that Norwegian was not Norwegian enough. And so he decided to come up with a new Norwegian variant called New Norse, but New Norse was actually Old Norse, based on dialects, and so brought back a lot of words that had not seen the light of day in this Danish Norwegian. That's the short version. 2 versions of it.
In this context, I've heard it said that the difference between a dialect and a language is politics. Is that true? Is this an example of that with Norwegian?
Absolutely. So Norway, the sentence that always comes up is a language is a dialect with an army and navy.
Yeah.
So, and I mentioned before. So, for example, in the history of German, which has been very well studied, the regionalisms of German existed long before Standard German. So people were speaking Bavarian and Swiss German, and then eventually, for various reasons, a lot of different reasons, a standardized German came up, and eventually people were able to say, folks again, they were able to say, hey, by the way, this is what German is now. So you Bavarians, you are now speaking a dialect. So what do you mean speaking a dialect? You've been speaking this way forever, but now you're speaking a dialect of German.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you say something about Middle English and its use by Chaucer? He apparently spoke French and Latin, but made a conscious decision to write in the vernacular of the day.
Middle English is a little scary. You might have seen my eyes go like this, because sometimes I look at it from a linguistic aspect. And when you study the changes in Middle English, you always have to say, yes, so here is a systematic change, but it only happened over here. And then over here, you have to learn a completely different set of changes. And Middle English is tough stuff. However, it starts to look much more like modern English than Old English did. So what I read before, that was Old English. Middle English, I can't, yeah, Chaucer was multilingual. And I probably should be able to say more about Chaucer and why he made that decision. But I, at the moment, don't have anything really brilliant to say about that. So I hope the next question is, I hope I can answer the next question better. I'm sorry.
Okay, because we're down to 3 minutes, I'm just powering on through here. How is the American accent related to, or how did it grow out of the British accent at the time of the American Revolution?
Yeah, that's tough. It was very often said that, well, so you had a lot of people coming over with different varieties of English coming from different places, different parts of England. But the big thing to keep in mind is that British dialects have changed a lot over the years, so over the centuries. So we, for example, think of most British people saying chair and bear without the R. It turns out even 100 years ago, a lot more people said bear and chair or variants of that. Some people still say it, and some people still say it to this day in England, especially in the Southwest. So it's a lot of, so there were a lot of different varieties of English that were coming across. This is like a whole semester topic, but what I can say is you should keep in mind that when you look at changes in American dialects, you also have to look at changes in British dialects over time.
Can all words be identified by origin? No, you go ahead. Yeah, I'll just leave it there because of time.
We can try. And as a matter of fact, my former employer and friend and colleague Anatoly Lieberman has spent about 30 years of his life trying to find the origin of every single word he can find. And yes, and some words cooperate and some words do not. The word I always go to is gazebo. And when I was working for him, we found in his, in forgotten journals, I found a series of about 5 or 6 articles trying to describe the origin of gazebo. And they were all probably wrong, but I think they just wanted to get their idea in print and say, hey, it could be this, or why don't I just write this just to say, just so that people know that is wrong. You can maybe I'll just have it so you can prove me wrong later. So many words have mysterious etymologies.
And I'd just like to add that Professor Anatoly Lieberman is a previous speaker in this series, and I believe we still have his talk linked to our website if anybody's interested in following up. Oh. I'm sorry to say we're out of time. We still have as many questions as when we started. Thank you so much,
Thank you very much
for just a tremendously interesting talk. Thank you to the people behind the scenes, Grayson and Carmi, for making this possible. Thank you to the audience for excellent, super questions. We really appreciate it, and we invite you all to come back next week when an old friend of our series, Ed Lauderman, will be here for the first of a double header. He's talking on two topics this time that are unrelated. The first one is next week, a century of carnal covetousness, U.S.-Cuba relations from 1789 to 1903. Needless to say, the title was the choice of Ed Lauderman. I wouldn't have come up with that. But I will see everyone next time, I hope. For today, I'll say thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.